Welcome to our Ripple event tonight. I am Rachel Garetta, and I am the Marketing Communications Director for Johnson Bixby and Integrated Tax Services. If you're new to Ripple events, that's simply the term we use to describe gatherings such as this one, where we share information and knowledge with our community. Our intent is simple: give you the information on important topics so you can walk away with insights and tools to make informed decisions about your financial situation and life in general. Tonight, we host Scott Bailey. Scott has worked as an economist for more than 38 years, majority of that time as a regional economist for the Washington Employment Security Department, covering Southwest Washington's labor market. During that time, Scott developed and worked on unique research on wage trends in the state, including contributions to the national dialogue on whether to raise the minimum wage. In addition to his work life, Scott was a longtime school activist in Portland and served a term on the Portland School Board. Scott retired from the state last September and now calls himself a free-range economist. He continues to teach at Clark College and to give presentations on the economy in the region like he is for us tonight. So Scott, we are thrilled to host you, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to all the good folks at Johnson Bixby for inviting me to speak. I'm going to share my screen now and get going on the presentation. There we go. Oh, and the laser pointer is working. We're good to go. Welcome to all of you, whether you're watching live right now or watching the tape later on. Because we're not in person, I can't take questions, but you see my email address there. I'm happy to take any questions that you have through email and follow up with you. I'll show that email address again at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. So today, what I want to do in the next half hour is try to answer the question, what's happening with the economy? I'm going to have to simplify some things because we have a time limit that I want to respect. And you don't want to listen to me for more than a half hour, but a half hour is good. In addition, I want to give you a few tips on how to interpret all the economic news that you see. It seems like every day, if you're paying attention to the news, there's some new statistic has come out, and then you see the talking head coming on and saying why this is the greatest thing since sliced bread or the end of the world, depending on. So let's get started with tip number one, which is most economic data when it comes out is preliminary, and it's going to get revised next month or the month after that. So for example, let's go back in time to March of 2011. Now in 2008, 2009, we had this horrendous recession. We were still crawling out of it in 2011. And what we're going to take a look at is the first estimate of what happened with employment in that month. And that was that it went up by 200,000 jobs. So here's some context. It takes about 100,000 new jobs, net new jobs every month, just for us to keep up with population growth. So anything more than that is a good news story in terms of more people are getting jobs, fewer people are going to be unemployed. Anything below that is a not so good. And of course, the job loss is really not so good. But the first estimate, over 200,000. A month later, the revision, about the same. A month later, another revision, a little bit weaker, but still pretty good. Now, a year after the fact, these preliminary estimates are based on a sample of employers. And there's always sample error anytime you have that, you're relying on a sample. But a year later, we have tax reports from every employer in the country with their monthly employment. So we have like the real thing. And what that showed is about a 200,000 job gain. So that preliminary estimate was spot on, really good. 3 months later, June of 2011, that initial estimate, wow, weak number, only about a 15,000 job gain, not good. The revised number was a little better. The second revision, back there. A year later, what really happened? A gain of over 200,000 jobs. So put yourself in the place of a policymaker. You're looking at preliminary numbers, trying to figure out what kind of actions you need to take. And you know that sometimes those preliminary numbers are steering you in the right direction, and sometimes they may be misleading. So remember that going forward. So we're going to start off with looking at what's going on in the current business cycle. Now, the business cycle is an economic phenomenon that's been happening for hundreds of years, where the first stage is the economy expands. That might last for 5 years, maybe even up to 10 years. The second stage, all good things come to an end. There's some kind of contraction. It might be relatively short, and that's a recession, or it may be more serious, like the Great Depression that we had back in the 1930s. And in 2008, we came perilously close to having that kind of a depression. Fortunately, we didn't go there. And then the third stage is once we hit bottom, we start to recover and come back to where we were, and then a new expansion starts. So economists look at 5 different factors to determine whether we're in a recession or expansion or recovery period. And the first one of these is gross domestic product. Now, GDP, as it's usually known, is the value of all goods and services produced in the country, and it's measured over a 3-month period quarterly. And what we usually look at is what's the percent change in this quarter compared to the previous quarter. So when you look at the history here, when GDP goes negative for 2 quarters in a row, as a rule of thumb, that means we're in a recession. So we had a recession back in 1991. We had a brief recession here in 2001, a deep one here in 2008, and then the COVID recession, which was a little crazy because it was caused not by economic phenomenon, but by a pandemic. So the GDP went down so rapidly that I kind of cut it off for this bar. It went down by about 33%, I think it was. And the next quarter, once we had kind of figured out what we could or couldn't do safely, it rebounded by about the same amount. And then we've been in a recovery and expansion period since then. So one takeaway from this. So here's a long expansion in the 1990s, and you see a lot of movement up and down. So the first rule of thumb, the first tip actually the second one, the first one is that all data is preliminary. The second one is don't get hung up on one data point. Now that's hard to do with what happens in the media now, which is basically a lot of times clickbait. They try to really jazz things up so you click and see, is it a disaster or is it great or what's happening? Really, you want to look at a long-term trend before drawing any conclusions. A second thing to take away from this, and by the way, the latest data point came out last week was that GDP was up by 1.6%. Some context, GDP between 2 and 2.5% is kind of a hold steady, looking good. More than that, we're expanding. Less than that, we're kind of slowing a bit, and negative, we're looking at a recession. So a lot of people got excited because it slowed down a bit. Chill. You notice those kind of slowdowns happen in every expansion. It's nothing to get excited about. So there are the other final thing takeaway here. Back in the first half of 2022, we had 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP. And all of a sudden, almost every economist in the country said we're either in a recession or we're going to be in one next month or in 2 months or next quarter, but a recession was inevitable. And a couple months went by and we weren't in a recession, and a couple months went by and we still weren't in a recession. But those recession calls predictions kept up for more than a year. Now, I read one in October by a really prominent economist who said, yes, in January, we're looking at going into a recession. And he had really good reasons for saying that. I thought, wow, that's very convincing. But then I went back a year and looked at what he was saying a year earlier, and it was the exact same thing. In 3 months in January, we're going into recession. He had good reasons for saying that. Yeah. So, our third tip, don't believe economic forecasts. Economists have a lousy track record at predicting. Economists have to make forecasts. We need some kind of educated guess for planning purposes, for businesses, for governments, have to do that. That doesn't mean you should take it as the gospel truth going forward. Always take it with a big grain of salt. Okay, now there are four other factors that economists look at to determine where we are in the business cycle. And one reason why I think I was one of the few people skeptical that we are in a recession 2 years ago was that those other factors were all positive. So we didn't see a broad-based downturn that defines a recession. We just saw one factor going negative while everything else was going up. Now I'm going to skip over three of them. They're all in decent shape right now in terms of continuing an upward trend, and focus on the fifth one, which is employment. And what I'm showing you in this slide is what happened to employment in the 2008 recession and recovery. So in 2008, at the beginning of the year, employment started to decline, and we lost about 6% of our jobs in a 2-year period. And there is a long, slow recovery. Now, it looks like we got back to where we were after 6 years. But in fact, because we've had population growth during that time period, remember, we need 100,000 jobs just to keep where we are. The true recovery in the labor market didn't happen until 10 years out. And why did it take so long? Bad policy. We had one weak stimulus package passed back in 2009, and then did very little more to stimulate the economy going forward. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank did keep interest rates low, but that wasn't enough to really help the economy go back. So we had millions of people out of work through no fault of their own, just because we had bad policy and slow growth over that 10-year period. So here's the contrast with the COVID recession. We had a really sharp downturn very quickly in employment, and then a lot of it came back fairly quickly as we figured out how to cope with COVID. And then over about a period of a year and a half, we went through a recovery, and for more than a year now, we've been in expansion. So the contrast is we had two big stimulus packages that put a lot of money in people's hands in order to keep the economy from going under while we figured out the pandemic. And it worked really well. We had a really rapid recovery in comparison to past recessions. And this is true for the other indicators that I haven't shown you. Personal income bounced back, industrial production bounced back, retail sales and restaurant sales after a while bounced back. So that's what a good stimulus package will do. Now I want to compare what happened nationally with what happened locally. So here's that 2008 downturn and recovery. Here's the US. Here's the state, which tracked the US for the first 6 years and then accelerated as Washington grew faster than the rest of the country. Seattle did even better. Portland did well. They were two of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, and Clark County did even better yet. We were along with the Tri-Cities, the two fastest growing areas in the state over that period in terms of new jobs. That's a good news story. Secondly, if we look at the COVID recovery, there's the national slide that I showed before. Here's the state. It's tracking the nation very closely. Here's Seattle, and it is lagging. And this is true of a number of metro areas. They just haven't kept up for a variety of reasons. Certainly, one of them is people working at home and not spending in downtown areas some more. Portland is doing even worse, so it is not yet back to full recovery. Clark County, however, is doing really well and is leading the state. Now, if we remember, I said we have firm data about a year ago, in this case, about 6 or 7 months ago. We have firm data up to this point, and everything since then is an estimate. I'm pretty confident that these numbers are going to be revised to show um, a pretty steady employment growth in Clark County going forward. Um, Okay, here's some more detail about job growth through the COVID cycle. We've had rapid growth and a lot of new jobs in a couple of industries, including construction. So think about, for example, all the activity on the waterfront, but also really throughout the economy, throughout the county, as we've had pretty good population growth. Um, so new housing until recently, and new commercial projects as well. Professional services, and a lot of these are high skill, high wage jobs, for example, in computer systems design. Healthcare, very rapid growth and our biggest growing industry. And even in restaurants and hotel motel, which really suffered in the pandemic, both have snapped back and have added jobs over the last 4 years. So a pretty good news story here. Now, here's some of the bad news. We had a really big bout of inflation in 2021, 2022. So looking at this chart, this is the monthly change. And what you see, again, going back to tip number 2, a lot of volatility. Don't get hung up on one point. Look at the trend. So this curve smooths out that trend. And what you see is way back when, this is before I was born, we had a pretty serious bout of inflation. In the 1970s, we had some serious inflation. A lot of that had to do with the price of oil going way up when OPEC was formed. And we had a run up for about 2 years. And let's look in some more detail on that. So we went from about an average of 2% inflation up to 8%, about a 6-point difference. Now, what caused prices to accelerate so rapidly in such a short time period? You can find a lot of opinions out there. Here's what the serious studies have shown. About one of those percentage points was due to the stimulus package being a little stronger than necessary. So we put so much money in people's hands that demand outpaced supply, and that pushed prices up. Secondly, we had all sorts of issues around supply chains. Some of that was due to, for example, we had meatpacking plants closed down for a couple months because of outbreaks of COVID. And so we had some shortages. We had all sorts of issues around, remember all the cargo ships that were backed up outside the port of Long Beach, and it took months for them to get into the harbor and to get unloaded. We had a trucking shortage at the same time. It was a mess. And because businesses weren't getting adequate supplies, the price of those supplies went up. That's what happens when there's a shortage. And so businesses pass those costs along to consumers. That's about 2 percentage points. The other 3 percentage points were caused by this. Corporate profits in the pandemic went way up. So for about 15 years, the average total profits was about 1.5 trillion. When COVID hit, it jumped all the way up to 2.5 trillion. An extra $1 trillion of what we're spending went to corporate profits. Now, how did that happen? How did they get away with raising prices in such a short period of time so steeply? Here's why. Beginning in 1980 and going all the way to 2020, we have antitrust laws on the books that help to break up monopoly power and to increase competition so that prices stay reasonably low. But beginning in 1980, both Republicans and Democrats, whoever was running the government, eased back on the enforcement of those antitrust laws. And as a result, big mergers went through that shouldn't have gone through. All sorts of monopolistic pricing, predatory pricing practices flourished. And we saw the emergence of big firms that were in a lot of industries and products where one or a handful of big companies controlled most of the industry, and they had pricing power and could increase prices and increase their profits. Some of those we know, like Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, and others we don't know because we don't see them directly. So it turns out when you're manufacturing a bicycle, for example, that some of the parts are produced by basically one producer. And so that company can raise prices, and what's going to happen? That price gets passed along in the price of the bicycle. So when prices went up during COVID due to legitimate reasons of the supply chain issues and costs going up, a lot of corporations said, well, we'll raise it to cover that, and then we'll raise it even more. And that's pushed prices up. The good news here is that, again, for the first time in 40 years, through the Biden administration, there's been a return of very aggressive return back to enforcing antitrust laws. So right now, the federal government has brought cases against Google, against Microsoft, against Apple, against Amazon, and a lot of others. They're looking at Ticketmaster. Again, if you bought a Taylor Swift ticket, you know how Ticketmaster will take a big fee on top of the ticket price. So, and that's a result of mergers. So that's what's happened, and there's some good news here. Now I'm going to look at a second not so good news thing, and that's interest rates going up. So the Federal Reserve, to fight inflation, raises interest rates. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It works when demand is what's driving higher prices, but in this case, demand is not. And right now, the biggest driver, and it has been over the last couple of years, is housing prices. And the reason that rents are going up and the price of buying a house is going up is due to shortage of supply. So ironically, what the Fed has done by raising interest rates is and here's the mortgage rate that's gone up to 7%. And I have to say, when I bought my house a long time ago, one, it was cheaper, but interest rates were 10%. And I was really happy to refinance 3 times to get down to 3%, right back at the total low point. So historically, 7% mortgage is not terribly high compared to what's happened over the last years, but it did cause a slowdown in housing construction. So ironically, what the Fed has done is slow down home construction where we already had not enough supply and made things worse, which is driving prices higher. So if you look at single family starts, we're increasing. And then when interest rates went up, they decreased, they bounced back a little bit, but they're still well below where they were, which was below where we needed them to be. And then secondly, multifamily housing was all the way up to 600,000 units a year. Now it's coming in at a rate of 300,000 a year. So the higher interest rates have kind of backfired. And what we've seen is housing prices, which dipped slightly, have now resumed rising again because of that shortage of housing. And that's not as true in Portland. It's trickling up now, but Seattle, after dropping down, is now going back up again. So I want to follow up these two bad news with some, oh yeah, Clark County, we've seen housing and permits drop from single family going from over 3,000 down to 2,000, multifamily dropping as well. So it's had a serious impact on housing. But as I was saying, now two good news stories. One is unemployment has been close to historically low levels for a couple of years now. That's just a really good news story. Now, when you look at unemployment by race, there's really vast disparities. And the rule of thumb for decades has been take white unemployment, double it, and that's what employment is for African Americans. And you can see that that's been pretty close to being true. The good news is that we recently hit the all-time low unemployment rate for African Americans, and it's really historically low right now. This has been the most equitable recovery on record. There's a similar for Latinos. Um, their unemployment rate averages between blacks and the average for all workers, and they've been close to the all-time low. Uh, Asian Americans, now Asian Americans include a lot of people from a lot of different places, some of whom's families have been here for generations. Others are really brand new immigrants. It's an incredibly diverse group. So let's not overgeneralize here. But in general, lower unemployment rate, and especially a number of immigrants lately have been from the Indian subcontinent. They come here with a lot of high-tech skills and so get immediate employment and higher wage employment. Um, and the unemployment rate for white Americans like myself tends to be a little bit lower than the average overall, and that continues to be true. If we had more time, we could slice and dice this, but we're going to go on to the next good news story, which is that wages in Clark County, and I've been tracking this for 30 years now, have continued to go up, and not only for the average, but also for the median, which means that half of workers earn above this amount, half below that. And if we look at, and especially during COVID, the median went up sharply because we lost low wage jobs. And then as low wage jobs came back, the median went sideways. But overall, compared with 2019, it's continued to go up. And what we saw in the recovery nationally was that wages for the lowest wage workers went up much faster and much faster than inflation compared to other workers. So that was a bit of a good news story. Does that mean that things are hunky-dory for low-income people? No. And if we have time, I'll get to a slide on that. The less than good news is while the average wage has been going up, wage disparities are still alive and well. And this is for workers in Clark County. For example, back in 1991, the average wage for indigenous workers was about 20% below the average for all workers. And it's still pretty much the same disparity in 2022. And that's true for women, for African Americans, and so on. So there's still a lot of inequity in the labor market. Okay, so given all that, where do I think the economy is headed? Well, at this point, you should remember tip number 3, which is don't believe economists when they predict the future. But I want to talk about a couple of good news things that are already baked in that make me feel pretty optimistic about going forward. One of those is, so Rachel and I were talking, am I going to talk faster than I thought or slower than I thought? And it's turning out to be, actually, I'm pretty close to being on time. One of the good news stories, here's spending on new factories. And in the last 2 years, it has doubled, which means we're going to have a lot of manufacturing capacity coming online very shortly. And the reason it's gone up is because of investments by the federal government. The CHIPS Act, which focuses on electronics, Not reflected in this graph is the infrastructure bill, which will likely lead to a new I-5 bridge, a lot of jobs there. Also, the Hood River Bridge east of us will hopefully be rebuilt. It really needs to be rebuilt. That's would be great news for the gorge. And projects like that around broadband and highways and so on, our bridges are happening all over the country. So that makes me optimistic both for the jobs in those projects, and when you invest in infrastructure, it helps the entire economy grow faster going forward. So that makes me feel pretty optimistic. In the last couple of slides, I want to focus on one or two long-term things. I actually have a whole laundry list, but I'm going to limit it to three because we're about a half hour in. The first thing is climate change. So we've had, I think it's 11 months in a row now of record temperatures every month. And part of that is because the Earth is getting warmer due to all the carbon dioxide and methane that's going into the atmosphere. But however, it's been accelerating because of El Nino. That's a cyclical thing. We'll move out of that in another year or two. Uh, However, we're headed for the current estimate is that in the coming decades will be 2.7 degrees centigrade warmer than when things started, which is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And that will have significant impacts on all sorts of things like animals and plants becoming extinct, like on agriculture, like on droughts that we're already seeing. All those kind of factors in play will lower economic growth by about 18% below its potential. So serious consequences. The good news, however, is that that 2.7% is lower than what we were predicting not that long ago. And it's because we've had an explosion of investment in solar power and wind power, much faster than anybody expected. A lot of it in China, some of it in the US, some of it in India is bringing on a huge new solar project. Bangladesh, a low-income country, is investing heavily. It's happening slowly all over. Could happen faster in low-income countries if the rich countries helped out, but it's happening much faster than we thought. At the same time, these renewable energies, because they're intermittent, sunny some days, not sunny the next day, wind blows, wind doesn't blow, energy storage has become crucial. And the good news there is that batteries are becoming much cheaper, exponentially cheaper, and the capacity for storing energy is growing exponentially as well, much faster than anticipated. So really good news there. And yet we're still looking at serious consequences unless we do even better than we're doing now on combating climate change. Second thing I want to focus on is COVID. Yes, COVID is over, except it's not. COVID cases are still around. They're milder. However, long COVID is still an issue. We have roughly 15 million people in this country who have serious long COVID symptoms. And we're really not sure what to do with that. Those people are largely invisible. They are dealing with some serious symptoms like the foggy brain, hard to think, hard to take care of yourself. Sometimes it's aches and pains and fatigue and memory loss, things like that. And we are not prepared for the next epidemic, whatever is coming. So that's a serious issue that's out there. Last thing is plastics, microplastics, nanoplastics. We're finding they're everywhere. And just in the last month, we've had the first two health studies that have come out saying, yeah, and this stuff is not good for you. So in the first study that's quoted here, that if you have a relatively high level of nanoplastics in your body, then it increases your risk of stroke and heart attack significantly. So there's going to be more of these kind of studies coming out. And I don't see any concerted effort to minimize plastic production. And in fact, the projections are that our capacity for producing plastics are going to go up 50% over the next 20 years with all the plans that are in the works. So that's a biggie out there. Other things I could go into, but it's about a half hour now. And so I'm going to stop. And there again is my contact information. Feel free to contact me. And I'm retired now. I got time on my hands. I'll be glad to reply to your emails and even maybe have a cup of coffee if you're into that. So thanks again to Johnson Bixby and Rachel for hosting this. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Scott. You left us on a negative. Give us a little bit,
Oh,
give us one more positive to wrap things up.
So my nickname for a long time in this community is Dr. Doom. So I feel like closing with a positive around climate change is pretty
Yeah, that
positive.
was.
Yeah, the
You should
plastic
have
thing.
switched the plastics in
All
there,
right, everybody's a critic.
no.
Yeah, so I am pretty optimistic about the economy short term. Um, I think there's just a lot we can do to address inequities that we haven't been doing, huge potential there. So I always have hope, but always we have to look at how things actually are
Yeah.
at the same time. But
Wonderful. No, it's really fun to see the place, obviously, where most of us are living and working and stuff, like in
yeah,
comparison to those national average. It kind of gives you a little bit of, little kind of confidence boost in how great it is
yeah.
to live here. So
Oh yeah. And this is my home in Northeast Portland. And I've lived in Northeast Portland most of my life. And I tell you, looking at government functioning now, wow, the city of Vancouver is doing a really great job. Um, just come
yeah.
on over to Portland. Good times.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And hopefully everybody got your email. And for those that are online listening to this, we have recorded this and we will be putting it up on Johnson Bixby's YouTube page. So you can go back and listen to it if you wish, anytime you want to share with your friends. And again, if you have
Once is
specific
enough.
questions for Scott, please reach out with his email. And with that, thank you again, Scott, for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.